We will proceed, as all the participants have been instructed, with short 5-minute interventions from each, commenting directly upon the paper that has been presented, but of course being aware that most other people haven't read it. So it will be sort of more general reflections around the topic and the way in which this topic is addressed, as we just heard, and partly in a very technical bibliometric way, but I think also in a way that brings out some really interesting substantive issues. So we'll proceed in the order that you're listed in the program. So starting with Yuqua-chan, please.
Thank you. Thanks to the organizer of the conference to let me have this chance to discuss with all of you my views about this newly written article just now presented by Aisha and Nathan. Well, I think I like a lot the article because it actually showed a lot of effort in summing up the development of migration studies in these past few decades, especially pointing out the different trends of the knowledge build-up in terms of cases, in terms of theories related to migration studies. And having said that, I also already in my written comments to the authors, some of the gaps there in presenting the fact and the development of migration studies in the past few decades. One particular gap there, I will say, is the lack of more elaboration on the Asian migration scholarship, which I think is important in pushing up this, in these past 2 decades, the writing, more publication about, and the training also of young scholars in the migration field. I gave a few points in the importance of having these, Asian migration scholars scholarship. Its contribution to migration studies. First, because actually why we have a field, why we have a research field is not just we are interested, we have the interest, but it's because of the fact that there are empirical cases, and this is the origin. I mean, this social phenomena is the origin of our so-called knowledge build up. So Asian migration in the past, at least 1.5 decades, had been leading migration mobility. So in Asia, we are producing most international migrants in the world. And we are receiving almost the most international and cross-border migrants also, just a little bit different with Europe. So it's very important in terms of the so-called world phenomenon of migration. And that's also why we have seen a large number, a very big growth in terms of research interests, both in publication and the training of PhDs, young scholars in the migration field. So it provides numerous empirical cases first. Second, because then it's a rich source for knowledge production, and then it sparks off interest from the younger layers of scholars. And then third, I think Asian migration scholarship has also contributed a lot to the theoretical refinement of migration in the migration studies. So I guess it is worth a little bit more elaboration in the article about this fact, and on the whole, I guess we need to know from where we actually see the development of theories and so-called theoretical knowledge about in the migration field. Just now you mentioned sociology, anthropology, that kind of back to the so-called mainstream disciplines. I think that may be one development, but at the same time, we also need to dig back into what happened in the theoretical refinement of migration studies in terms of feeding back to these mainstream disciplines. You miss out political studies. How migration studies have helped or provide new knowledge to political science. And perhaps these past 5 years, we saw a lot more about our contribution to, migration studies contribution to political science. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you. That was very exactly 5 minutes. Very good. And we proceed with Josh, please.
I found the article that was described to you as somewhat overwhelming and perhaps humiliating. The field was much bigger than I imagined. I knew it was bigger than I could comprehend, but now I know it's bigger than anybody can comprehend. But I'm grateful for the analysis, which provides an overview and insight into the field as a whole. So the article makes a terrific descriptive contribution. I don't know whether institutionalization is a good thing or not, or whether it should be a goal. And I say that after spending 25 years at the Social Science Research Council trying to promote what may be described as the institutionalization of migration studies. But now that this article makes it a central thesis, it allows me to be skeptical and wonder whether this is really such a great idea. Another way to put it would be that migration studies exist, as was just explained, because of migration and because of the social and political concerns that migration raises, which in turn stimulates funders to try to investigate migration, which in turn means that it's possible to have an infrastructure and funding for research. So if migration ceases to be an issue of central social and political concern, then migration studies really has no particular purpose to be institutionalized. But so I see it as a contingent relationship that migration studies exist, but whether it ought to be institutionalized it implies a certain amount of permanence which may not be necessary and may not be a realistic goal. Let me say that I would have undertaken a study of institutionalization of the field quite differently than the study presented. This is not to say that that I would have had a better way to look at it, but rather just a different way because of my own background and involvement in the field. In my commentary, I described the field as being like the elephant in the ancient Indian parable of the 5 blind men who are asked to describe what is an elephant like, and each one grabs a piece of the elephant and says, well, it's like a tail, it's like a trunk, it's like a foot, it's like an ear, and that's the field. So maybe I've got a piece of the ear that I can, as the basis of my experience, but I claim no knowledge or expertise for the field as a whole. So my comments, I would have done it differently, but maybe that's because I really had the tail, and maybe I thought I had the trunk, I don't know. But anyway, but I think that's one of the important points, is that institutionalization implies, the way the article describes it, a certain amount of coherence and regularity and shared concepts, shared references, quite a bit of what I fear is homogenization of the field and a lack of diversity, a lack of conflict, too much agreement perhaps. That's not necessarily the case. There's a lot of controversy. But institutionalization, the way it's described, implies a certain amount of homogenization, which is why I'm skeptical that we ought to be thinking about institutionalization as a goal rather than as perhaps a unintended consequence of the field. Migration studies exist because people talk to one another, and if they stop talking to one another, the field disappears. Should that conversation be institutionalized or not? I think one of the major divides, perhaps, or split concerns, one of the two different concerns within the field, not a divide necessarily, not at all, but two different approaches in the field focus on theory and focus on practice. As a social science, migration studies tries to explain migration, the origins, the processes, and the outcomes. Why did it happen? Why does it happen the way in which we observe it in our research? Why is the big question. This paper addresses how. Not why did institutionalization take place, but rather how do you describe it? How did it take place? What have we got here? And I think that's an important stepping stone to our then thinking about why the field came about in the first place. And that's related, I think, to the second aspect, which is migration studies not only seeks to explain, but migration studies, and much of this conference is focused on how to inform public debates and how to inform policymakers and practitioners or activists. So on the one hand, we seek to explain, but on the other hand, we seek to make our knowledge relevant and useful to others. Well, explanation and usefulness are not necessarily the same thing. I had the privilege of reading Steve Vertovec's comments before coming here, and unfortunately Steve's not here. But he spends much of his comments talking about how social science researchers can and should be able to make their comments useful to the public. And his answer in the end finally is, well, what we have to do as social scientists is educate the public so that the public understands that migration is more complex in its origins and outcomes than anybody imagines. Well, that sounds like a professor teaching students who, and it doesn't sound to me like really reaching out to policymakers, but nonetheless, that's a challenge, is that as explainers, we have a lot to explain, and as policymakers, they're too busy and have a lot to do. So anyway, but the field of migration studies comes about as a result of the relationship or tensions between these two goals and sets of people. I thought today maybe we ought to describe it as the academic nation-state complex. Thinking back of General Eisenhower back in the United States, warning about the industrial military complex in the United States. Well, we have an academic nation-state complex in which the field of migration studies emerges from the relations between the two. This isn't what I was going to say, but it comes to mind now as important, which is the paper gives a lot of importance to the internationalization of migration studies, and in that internationalization gives a lot of importance to the notion of methodological nationalism and transnationalism as being necessary or at least useful conceptual tools for the field's internationalization. I think that's wrong. There's no doubt that notions of transnationalism and methodological nationalism have given us a self-consciousness about the origin of our concepts, of our data, of our ideas about the importance of migration. But if that's a form of deconstruction of our thinking, that's great. And it provides huge insights. I think the biggest insight is that transnationalism, instead of conceiving of migration as being a national phenomenon, we now conceive of it in a wider frame of reference. That's not a theory, that's just a scope. It's like, instead of looking through a telescope, we're now looking, I don't know, through what? But you can see with a broader vision. That's great, that's important. But we still have to explain and understand what's going on. Methodological nationalism is a critique that that basically says that we shouldn't be thinking as if we were members of the state or the nation state. We should be thinking as academics. So we should be explainers rather than practitioners. But still, if methodological nationalism provides insights, it should be insights into the importance of nation states in guiding and channeling migration and establishing the status of migrants and determining their life chances and opportunities. Nation states still do that. Nina Glick-Schiller coined the notion of transnational migration based on the notion that transnational corporations exceed nation states and are somehow escaping their control. And her thought was, well, don't migrants do the same thing? And the answer is, well, sure, to some extent, but not as much as transnational corporations. And increasingly what we see in the world is transnational corporations are constantly under the supervision and control of nation states, and migrants are too. So we need the concept of methodological nationalism and transnationalism not to get beyond or transcend a national framework, but rather to go back and understand it. At least that's my point of view. My time must be up by now.
But we'll get back.
And I haven't even gotten to the points I wanted to make, but thank you.
We'll get back to some of that.
I was trying to count the years. I think it's about 40 years that I've been doing this. So that's a long time. Renus Penix, when I walked in, we immediately recognized each other, but I look around the room and the vast majority of the people in the room I do not know. This is my first time actually coming to IMISCO, even though I've been doing this for 40 years. So I'm very grateful for the invitation. And of course, the thing that keeps us all moving and going as scholars is meeting new people, meeting others in the field. So I hope over the next day or two, I'll get a chance to actually meet and talk with a lot of you. And Josh DeWind, when I walked in, I didn't see Josh, but he yelled at me. And I remember sitting on some of those committees, the SSRC committees. And when I sat down, Josh said to me, everyone organizing this meeting looks like a very young person. And my reaction was, well, they are young, we are old. So we've been doing this for quite some time. But to the point of this very interesting paper, and I don't know how many of you in here have had a chance to read it, I'm just going to make a series of points, and then I guess we can come back to this in the discussion. But I think my first comment echoes the comment of our Chinese colleague on the other end of the table here, which is, this is a field, not surprisingly, which is incredibly ethnocentric. It is a very Western field, I think, has been traditionally. I would even narrow that down and say, if you look at some of that clustering in the graphs, it's a very Anglo-Saxon field. I mean, you see the U.S. Bureau of the Census, I think, right in the middle of the picture. What the heck what's going on there? Ironically, I've always thought the Dutch and the Anglo-Saxons were in the same situation, but it's also very heavily a Dutch field. Now, I don't know if that reflects the bias and the assumptions of the analysis of our Dutch colleagues. But this is a very Western-centric field. And I think there's no question that, looking at these settler societies, I mean, there's a reason why the first, I think, real school of migration studies, started in Chicago with the Park School, the sociologists. I'll come back to that in just a minute. Because that's where, these were immigrant societies. And I do think you can't separate the history of migration studies from the history of imperialism and colonialism. You can't get around that, and it's been very much dominated by this. But migration today, of course, we have all woke up suddenly and discovered that there's a lot more going on than what you're looking at in the US, Britain, or England, or the Dominions, or even the Netherlands, or Western Europe. Most migration is south-south. The colleague from China indicated that there's more migration going on in Asia, I think, than the rest of the world combined. So we clearly are going to have to change the geographical, the cultural focus of our study of migration. Fortunately, I have a book coming out that does just this, called Understanding Global Migration. I hope it will be out sometime this year, which brings together scholars from around the world to try to understand how the globe is stitched together by what I call migration interdependence, understanding the different systems and subsystems of migration. You wouldn't believe how complicated it is just to study Africa. And my colleagues who are specialists in Africa always remind me that Africa is not a country, it's not a state. It's an incredibly complicated place. Stitching all this together, that's what this book, Understanding Global Migration, is trying to do. On the internationalization question, I was a little confused by that. I think a little bit like Josh DeWind. I think I would go back to what I said earlier. We know we're making progress in internationalization when it's not just the English-speaking scholars who are citing each other, but perhaps we're able to cite our Chinese colleagues or people from other languages, other regions of the globe. On epistemic communities, I don't know exactly what to say about that, except that I would really like to see more about the methodology and the assumptions that went into this. Really, I think the only way to get at this paper is to go back and really examine some of the basic assumptions that you have in there. On co-citation, and again, I apologize for all the, probably, I don't know, we could take a poll here and see how many disciplines are represented in this room, but if you look at those pictures, I mean, you can see just the overwhelming dominance of sociology, demography as disciplines, economics, maybe to some extent. I was a student really of Alex Portes. I see Portes is got his own node in this, so there's a whole Portes epistemic community, I guess. But I'm an economist basically by training. And I remember Alex wrote a piece in the International Migration Review years ago about sort of the history of migration studies. And when he got to the discipline of political science, he said, there's nothing has happened really in the study of the politics of migration. So I sat down and wrote him a long note, and I said, you should at least cite your former students, who are working in this field. And to his credit, he went back and rewrote the piece and actually put more in there about what's going on in the politics of migration. Just to wrap up, to come back where the previous, I guess the slide is still up there, this future research. Well, there's actually some previous research on talking across disciplines. Many of you know the migration theory book itself. And I give all the credit for that book to my colleague Caroline Bertel, the anthropologist who's not here. She wanted to do that. We did it at a social science history meeting, and then I worked to turn it into a book. But many of you, I'm sure in this room, know that book, and we could go through the whole intellectual history of the field, looking at the sort of disciplinary caricatures, from sociology to economics to demography, talking about structure and agency, and the debates that go on between the social sciences. I just would maybe conclude with one little anecdote about Caroline. Years ago, she's a very, very famous cultural anthropologist, and there was a seminar going on in the economics department about the political economy of immigration. So I convinced her to go with me to the seminar, and she was very angry after about a half an hour. She said, "This is just nonsense. These guys have no idea what they're talking about. It's just a bunch of equations." And I told her, I said, well, there's the economists have a very utilitarian, rationalist approach to the study of these phenomena. And she looked at me and she said, well, everybody knows that rationality is socially constructed. So why would you be so hung up on this thing about rationality and utilitarian models? Final thing I will say is I'd like to talk about the politics of international migration, which is really my area. I don't have time to do that. Should we be moving towards a unified field of study? I will conclude on that question. And I would just say, especially for the young scholars in the room, be careful what you wish for. It's a big trade-off here between building your careers in individual disciplines, getting your articles published in the appropriate journal, and then trying to create some unified field of migration studies. So I think we have to be careful trying to move the field into, different departments of migration studies. I think there's a lot of creative tension between the disciplines, between social science. But we have to be careful, of course, about not constantly reinventing wheels. So we have to be very aware of what's going on in all of the different disciplines. If we're not attentive to that, then there's a danger that we reinvent the wheel. And of course, final point, everybody in this room knows you cannot study migration from a single discipline. It is too complex to do that. If you ignore the politics, if you ignore the state, as Josh DeWind said, you ignore it at your own peril. So you can't just do agency, you also have to do structure. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Eleonore, please.
Thanks very much, and I want to follow on a number of the comments that have made before. And what I wrote in my contribution was basically about uneven internationalization and the emergence of an epistemic community which is not transnationalism or assimilationism and integration studies, but gender and migration, which I think has become a very strong epistemic. You could call it a sub-epistemic if you want, but it has become a very strong form of community within the field of migration studies, with links obviously with other disciplines. But what I wanted to do very briefly today is just to look at exploring much more in depth and looking at the whys rather than the hows of why this unequal and uneven internationalization. So first point I just want to pick up is the publishing industry. It is very much in the global north and linked largely with the Anglo world, and I think that's something which is quite important. I went through and I asked a few colleagues, you name me a really well-known migration journal which is not being published in the north. One of the ones that I can think of is precisely the Asian Pacific Migration Journal. It's an English language journal which was published in 1992 originally in Manila, and now is being published by Sage. So, as a result of being published by Sage, it will get a lot more distribution than it did in its original form. So it'll be very interesting to see it. And of course, it had some magnificent articles that came out in the mid-90s, really pushing the theory. Again, I don't think they've been taken up adequately. So that's, reinforcing what you said. The second, I think, is even more serious, is the politics of translation. Now, you've looked largely at English language, and although the country specialists who were asked to input looked at other languages in other countries, what we find is still very clearly, if you do not write in English, your ideas simply do not circulate. And I can give you a whole series of examples of that, of the non-circulation of ideas simply because you're not writing in English. And as I say, actually, the European Union is one of the best institutions for the circulation of material in English, which is, I think, very ironic, but that is as it is. A third aspect which I think we need to look at is power relations. And this is, again, the issue about the reasons. It isn't just, of course, there is an uneven internationalization, it's the power relations, particularly between North and South, and within the North as well. And here again, as I move towards talking about some of the gender and migration issues which come up in terms of the unevenness, there's been a long-standing debate amongst feminists about the unequal relationships between North and South, and the fact that the North is the locus of theory and the South is of data. I mean, Jørgen would hopefully you support me on that one. And I think here we need to look at, for example, Raewyn Connell's work, on Southern theory, where she sums up and she says, the writing of the marginalization of theory produced in the South, and she argued almost all the feminist thought that circulates internationally and addresses economic or cultural globalization is based on concepts and methods developed in the global North. The center produces theory, the periphery, data, and politics. And I think that's all too true. And of course, this links up with something which has not been discussed at all. There is a huge literature about decolonizing the curriculum, for example, these days, decolonizing knowledge. And I think we need to bring that into the whole equation. And I just want to give an illustration of this, looking at the development of gender and migration as an epistemic community, because I didn't have any bibliometrics here to use, so I just went back to some key books. And one of the first, I think it's the first handbook, came out in 2000, and it was the Handbook of Gender and Migration. And interestingly, it was edited by two development specialists. One of them, Katie Willis, who worked on Latin America, the other, Brenda Yo, of course, who worked on Asia Pacific, and Asia in particular. And it was very interesting looking at the articles in this handbook, because I was absolutely taken aback. It was very global. There was a minority of articles on North America and Europe. And the one theory chapter, of course you'd have more theory these days, but the one theory chapter was using structuration theory, which actually developed out of a lot of Asian research, and applied to South Africa. I thought, wow, this isn't at all what you get if somebody did a handbook now, because it'd be much more focused on North America and Europe. And so I think that I would actually argue that, unfortunately, I think we've taken a step backwards. Because if in 2000 we could produce a handbook which was far more global, for example, if you take Saskia Sassen's work, she didn't start looking at counter circuits in the north of migration. Her original work was on the maquiladores on the Mexican-US border, and she was much more interested in the south than she was in the north. Now, I could go on endlessly about the reasons for that. I think I'm going to write about it as well, much greater. So we need to do some historical work, I think, in depth, probing that. So just to finish here, exactly, that's the point that I wanted to make, is that if we look at what's been happening, I would argue that we've had a shift, actually, to the prominence of the North, that I think within gender and migration and the kinds of issues that it's raised. At the same time, I think we have had an incorporation of Asian work, particularly through the work being done in Singapore, in Taiwan, in Korea, in Hong Kong, and in Japan. But as one of the writers said in relation to that, that despite creating its own multipolar, decentered ways of knowledge production, this is the issue of Asian research, its contribution has still not received the attention that it deserves. So in summary, I would say, although the gender and migration epistemic community has been extended geographically, its internationalization remains very uneven, albeit with a bringing in of more scholars from other parts of the North, because I think the Asian research is from the global North nevertheless. But what do we have is that there are still large parts of the globe which are unrepresented. And part of it has got to do with the politics of translation. There is plenty of research in Latin America, but it's in Spanish. Many Latin American scholars do not write in English. Africa is a different issue, and I think we need to look at where different parts are not represented, there are different reasons. So my argument is we need to explore much more fully the whys of this unevenness and the validity of theory, because it's Northern theory which is still held to be the most valid. Thanks.
Thank you. Then, Luca, you have the floor and the last intervention.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here in this panel that was presented as some expert scholars working for many years on these topics and commenting on it. Should have been at the end Luca. I'm bringing kind of a different perspective to this conversation, maybe. Being, as Jørgen presented, I kind of, I have, my job is to understand and look at the research, migration research scholarly field, and understand what else needs to be done, how to push this forward, where to put the money, where to bring, funding in, and when is that, where is that needed. And actually, in these days, in these weeks, I'm really in the process of doing that. So we have our next work program in Horizon 2020. Actually, it will be first work program of Horizon Europe coming up, and so we are in that phase. And so I'm looking back to the field, to the migration research field, and to what we as Horizon have contributed to it, and previously the different framework programs. And of course, the first banal and obvious point to make is that there's just so much out there. So when my boss comes to me and says, "Okay, Luca, please look at what needs to be funded in an original way, really something that has not been done before," I'm in a bit of a position because we were talking over lunch with Jim and Renus about the impact of migration for origin countries in the 1960s or things like that. So as regards reinventing the wheel, as Jim was saying, there's quite an issue there to untangle. So the question I'm asked then is, okay, well, there's more research needed on migration. Then have you just completed the circle? The question is, the answer is, of course, yes. There are different cases. There are different. There's many different aspects which still need to be better understood and conceptualized. But at the same time, it's important to still consider what has been done, what to do with that. And I think as a funding body, Horizon has also contributed to this, putting a lot of money and investment into projects, and then also leading to a kind of moving from a project to another, kind of almost littering the web with, websites of past projects which did not think as well on sustainability as cross-migration has, and so kind of have finished their life cycle and just ended there. So, and then this also links to a point on what policy needs, because Horizon, as many of you know, on one hand, when thinking about how to shape our framework programs, we think about scientific excellence, what's needed in framework research. On the other, we think about, okay, what new questions have emerged for policy, and how can we help on that. But I have to say that even the questions that emerge from policy, when I ask my policy colleagues, I think oftentimes, well, we've been there, It's elements that are already part of our field and are already part of the wealth of literature that Peter has discussed. So there's the issue there needs really to be seen carefully, especially considering this kind of the cycles of migration policy and how even old literature, even old work can be reapplied, and we don't need to reinvent everything starting over again. And I think that's really important to consider this when talking about migration policy and its relation with evidence. It's not always new evidence that is needed. We already have a lot there. Which leads me kind of to my second point. Another point in which I feel I'm confronted with is sometimes I maybe get the feeling that we are taking migration too often. Maybe I don't know if as a field, but we are taking migration too often out of broader systems of which it is part of, kind of exceptionalizing it in some sense. And that's probably a clear consequence of the institutionalization of the field, starting really to talk more amongst each other across disciplines, maybe, and with different disciplines being integrated in. But probably we could benefit from different fields being brought in more. By this I mean. Simply again, going back to Horizon 2020, is also our responsibilities on it. Just to bring a case, we've put 100 millions of funding from 2018 to 220. That's a real lot of money. Really asking specific questions on migration with projects composed by 10, 12 partners, migration experts, etc. And I feel that we could have benefited a lot by opening it up a little and bringing in different perspectives from different people working, for example, on labor markets, but from a different angle, or on education, but from a different angle, on child policy, but on a different angle. And these conversations could have probably helped us maybe a bit more in advancing. Even, just working with people that have different biases compared to what we have in the migration scholarly field. I've been working on migration, I don't know, for 7 years now. I have particular ideas and about it. I have particular biases about migration with which I approach my work, and probably engaging in my work with people that have different positions or have thought about it less, very simply, probably could help us move forward. And my third point then, to conclude, maybe is just, being policy officer in the European Commission, a point on policy relations. And it's, it comes from my first 2 points. On one hand, we know so much about migration, and we've got so much knowledge, which is still not being processed, in policy terms and in political terms at all, or to a very limited extent compared to what is there. And so what maybe could be done even more importantly than developing more and more research on migration could be understanding, the context, the processes of decision-making on migration issues, on migration policy, trying to understand better this issue of evidence. Where can it fit? What is specific to migration policy making, to migration decision-making processes? And I think this could help out a lot. I see this in my work on Horizon projects. Horizon has, I think, a lot of you have worked on Horizon projects probably, and it has a very strong impact component. It had in Horizon 2020. Horizon Europe will be even more so. Horizon Europe, even just building your proposal, the central piece will be paving the way for your targeted impact. So really being concrete and precise about how to achieve that. And I think that this knowledge about decision-making processes and dynamics is something that could really help out more in bridging this gap. We always talk about the famous bridging the gap between research and policy, and I think really understanding that could help greatly. And finally, and I think it goes back maybe to the point of exceptionalizing migration, of kind of abstracting it a bit from the broader processes within which it works. I think there's a point to be made here on this tendency and how this feeds into a greater politicization of migration. And I think that as migration research scholars, rather than maybe contributing to this conversation in such a way, it could even be more useful to help depoliticizing it by inserting it and reflecting on it from different lenses and perspectives of broader issues, maybe that can be even less contentious, for example, of which migration is a part of. But it's not the kind of central, central piece of study. Or kind of the lenses is much broader than just the migration focus. And I think this could be a way also to help migration policy understand, the complexity of migration and how it really links up with different systems, and how it should really be seen as part of different systems. As the solutions will probably, but the way forward will probably come in associations with change that happens in different systems: economic, social, political, demographic, environmental, etc. So I think in terms of going forward from my perspective here, of someone that's deciding or starting a process of decision of where to put funding, these are things that I think I'm thinking about at the moment, and I'm trying to understand how these can be squared, let's say, to move the research field on, let's say. So I think.
Thank you. So, not surprisingly, we've spent a bit more time on the original interventions than in the plan. So, I suggest that we focus the remaining time on one issue that emerged quite strongly, I think, as a defining one for where we stand now in migration studies, and that is the issue of this uneven internationalization, which I think maybe more than many of the other points that came up in the article sort of defines this moment in the sense that it's, I think it's increasingly experienced as something that is a challenge that we have to deal with, a legitimacy problem, a problem for sort of creativity and innovation, and yes, on many different levels, and many of you picked up on it, and also the research policy or society interface is something that we will get back to in another roundtable tomorrow. So to kick off this discussion on the uneven internationalization, I'll briefly refer to a special issue of GEMS that is in the pipeline that I'm part on migration in China, where part of the idea was to use Chinese experiences to theorize and not just write empirically on China. And it's so striking how, when other parts of the world are brought into this Eurocentric or Anglo-Saxon-centric paradigm or establishment, it is very often in the form of empirical illustrations or examples. And I think the blame, to some extent, sits on both sides in the way that very often, for instance, a lot of the really great migration research that takes place in Asia is defining itself specifically in an Asian setting. So migration theory in Asia, migration and the family in Asia. Whereas when we have, in a way, similar workshops in Europe or North America, we just call them migration theory or migration and the family, and we don't say in Europe or in North America. And we implicitly claim this sort of more general or theoretical perspective with no real foundations, I think, compared to a lot of the research that goes on in other parts of the world. But this is also very much reflected in the dominant literature. So preparing this article as a special issue, I looked at prominent migration textbooks, and of course it's striking that, you know, The Age of Migration, other classical texts have lots and lots of references to Europe and North America compared to what there is to other parts of the world. But guess which book has the most uneven reference pattern or mention pattern of all? That's the eminent book of James and and Caroline on migration theory, where there are 150 mentions of the US and 1 mention of China. And I think that tells us a lot about how we approach the theoretical versus empirical aspects of migration research and the sort of territoriality of that.
We will fix that in the 4th edition.
Good. So I think there is a bit of a challenge in how we move forward in this situation. On the one hand, we could, in a way, bring in greater diversity in a sort of pluralist perspective and say, this is the Asian perspective, this is the African perspective, this is the Latin American perspective, and so on. But that could run the risk of simply reinforcing this unevenness. And the alternative is more of a mainstreaming approach and making sure that, you know, our theory should be as global as possible. But we know from other mainstreaming experiences that very often that's a good intention, but it doesn't happen in reality. So as migration scholars and the migration scholar community, how do we take this forward? I would like you to respond first.
No, because I mean, I thought we were asking questions from the audience, or are we not?
We can do that as well, even more.
We've already spoken.
You have, true. So we'll let the panelists rest and open up for input from the audience. And we have a microphone and some assistants to give whoever wants to say something in the microphone. Please just briefly introduce yourself first. And we can collect a couple of comments or questions. So anyone else, please give me a signal.
Well, good morning. I'm Fernando Fishman. I'm from Argentina, from Latin America, so I can. That's why I'm talking now, because I can say that what you just said is true. There's a lot of scholarship in Spanish about migration in several different disciplines, not only in migration studies, actually anthropology. I'm an anthropologist myself. I wrote a book. I just brought it with me, and I said, "Who am I going to give it to?" It's in Spanish. So we work not only from the point of view of migration, but also from interculturality. I work at Flaxo, School of Latin American Social Studies, and I put together a program on migration, a graduate program on migration. And the first issue that I put there was indigenous culture, indigenous people. They pre-exist the nation states. They were there. They moved around from one place to the other one, even before the national states we know them today existed. So how can we not talk about indigenous populations when we talk about migration? The other thing about nationalism, methodological nationalism, I think that's also true in terms of we need to look at national histories. I mean, it's okay, it's great to deal with international, with methodological nationalism, but we need to still focus on national histories. For instance, Argentina has seen itself as a country of migrations, of migrants, from the late 19th century. So it has a very singular history, and that has also influenced the academic work on migration. So we still need to keep that in mind and continue working on that. I think that's all for the moment. I don't want to monopolize.
May I continue? Okay. Yeah? I'm a Ukrainian partner, I would say. Just a very brief comment, continuing the issue of uneven internationalization. I wonder if the cross-migration project and probably the expert consider of continuing the creation of mega data with focus on, well, widely Russian-speaking literature, because I know that Asa is from Russia, and I think Russian is not there. Although probably Russia is not the most powerful place in terms of the migration theory, they still do their best in focusing on very practical issues and doing large-scale research, because, well, admit that Russia remain to be the magnet for incoming migration, and I think we have to probably take into account their input too, just as an idea.
Right at the other end of the... Yes.
Thank you. Ferruccio Pastore from Fieri, Italy. I think it was Josh DeWind who focused part of his remarks on the contingent relation between the phenomenon of migration, or the construction of a phenomenon in society and in politics, and the process of institutionalization, the construction of a phenomenon in the academia, in expert communities. I really think this is crucial for this sort of reflexivity efforts that we are making, which I think is a great thing. And if you look at it from this point of view, I think that the original mission of migration studies, so to put it, in the US originally, I mean, the Chicago School was mentioned, had a lot to do with society building in context of massive change, massive social change. And indeed, also in the European case in the 80s, 90s, this was very much the case. I mean, how to cope with societal change and how to build or rebuild or keep, a society viable. And of course, with very deep interplay between political discourse, political knowledge, and analytical knowledge. And in this phase, clearly the focus was on migrants, on immigrants, on those who were the factor of novelty in social dynamics. Now, what I see happening now, but I want to know if you also see this change in paradigm, perhaps, is a reverse of a focus, mainly due to the growth of anti-migrant populism, which pushes many of us to look at, to reverse our gaze and to look at natives or previously existing populations and how they react to migration. So it's not so much, it seems, in some of our societies about society building, but about preventing society breaking. And this you see also very clearly in the EU research policy on migration, a fast-growing number of calls on populism, on xenophobia, on the other side. So, but is this still migration studies? Because we are not only studying migrants, and we try to reverse and expand our gaze. So how to cope with this also from this reflexive point of view? Do we still, for instance, catch this literature with these bibliometrical parameters? Probably not, because it goes far beyond. It happens in other disciplinary domains. How do you view this, and how can we contribute to this? Thank you.
Thanks for good questions. I'm afraid they will have to stay with us during the coffee break.